Yes, we're gonna start over. Apologies, everyone.
I'm going to consolidate this, what we just went through, because, right, this is, thank you, Bruce. This is what we do in a crisis, right? We adjust on the fly, we adapt to the situation, and we meet the immediate need and move on to the next issue. So let's do it then. But I'm not going to skip the happy St. Patrick's Day to all those who celebrate it. Today, we're going to be talking a bit about responding to the obvious pandemic situation that we have here. As I had said before, the worst time to plan for a crisis is when it hits. Yet that's where a lot of us find ourselves right now. And this is not just a health crisis. It is a business crisis of the highest order. So today we're going to talk about how to start dealing with this. And in particular, we're going to focus on legal issues that are impacting organizations, really breaking legal issues, I have to say. Let me just start off to frame the discussion a little bit, though, because a lot of you I haven't worked with before, and so this is our first introduction. We've got about 200 people on the call here today, and so thank you all for joining us. My name is John Graff. I am a partner in the higher education, litigation, and consulting practices here at Hirsch, Weinstein, and I focus most of my time helping colleges and universities get ready for and then manage emergencies. And I'm talking about large and small institutions. And so what that really focuses on is prevention, planning, response, and then recovery afterward. Let's talk a little bit about what the scope of what we need to cover today. First, we've got the federal government acting on a bill that's evolving in real time. I mean, it was just adjusted again yesterday. Kathy Rubin, my law partner, is going to help us talk about what that bill means for us as employers, what type of impact it's going to have on employees and on businesses across the country. Obviously, this is impacting staffing levels in the workforce. Pete Moser, to my right, is here to help us break that down. There are significant time off implications to all of this. What is happening with time away from work during this event? Charlotte Padilla and Julia Russo. This feels like I'm in the studio for some reason. I do need Aaron's technological assistance with something though. Okay. So let's frame it first to understand it. What is a crisis? It is very, very important for us to have an understanding of what a crisis is. What does the definition mean? To start to put this into some kind of context so that we can put it in a manageable framework. So a crisis is a threat. It comes on out of nowhere. It threatens the survival of an organization. And it has a very, very short decision time frame. We've got to make critical judgments in the moment in order to determine what course of events our company is going to experience in the future. Most importantly, though, we have to remember a crisis ends. Every single crisis ends at some point. It may not end the way that we want it to, but it does end. And so I think if we start to look at something, even like a pandemic like this, and understand that this is going to pass, it will help us understand what steps we need to take in order to help it pass more quickly. There are 4 key steps to managing a crisis, and they are the same 4 steps you use to walk across the street on any given day when you leave your house. We look around, we prioritize, we make a decision, and then we execute on that decision, okay? Things are not always gonna go as planned. And as we know, there's no perfect in a crisis. We saw that just a little while ago. We had a tech issue, we responded, and now we're rocking and rolling, right? There's no perfect, there's only survival or defeat. In a crisis, our goal is to survive, and that requires a survival mindset. And that's why we're talking a little bit about how to understand a crisis in context. So a couple of quick action items before we get into the legal issues here. And these are things that, hopefully everybody will write down, because they're going to become critical to your ability to manage, whether you're a small company or a large company. First, we need to get good advisors on board. Those are subject matter experts and consultants, if you need them, like Dr. Bruce sitting across from me here. People who know each key area of your organization very well should be on your team. And people who know what a successful key area like that should look like should be part of your discussion. So if you don't have that kind of expertise, that's when you start to consult with the outside world. To borrow a phrase from law enforcement, intel, so I used to be a police officer, we need to get a good, solid intel system in place very early on. You know, we could have 5 leaders chiming in on media development, social media developments. That's not intelligence. You need an actual system to manage the information. And so our goal here, we're hearing news breaking every single day, every hour of every day, really. Twitter's out of control, Facebook's out of control, Instagram. Then you have actual live media, the news networks, etc. That's not intelligence, that's chaos. We're looking to find simplicity on the other side of complexity. My suggestion is you appoint a person to manage the information and provide a daily briefing to you on what is happening and where things are likely to go. We use a format in law enforcement. What's happening? Why did it happen? And what's likely to happen next? You should use that same format to gather your intel and start assessing it so you can figure out next steps for your company. I think, you know, it's very important also when we're talking about exchanging information within a company that we tear down communication protocols. In a crisis, running everything up the flagpole to be approved before it goes out to a team is never going to work. If we don't trust our intel person to brief our boss, then our intel person should not be our intel person. We need to get an internal and an external communications platform in place. We never want to assume that our employees know everything just because they're on Facebook, Twitter, etc. And I'll go out on a limb here and just say that, you know, though this is a very serious situation, I do think the media is playing its part in making the panic a little bit worse. So we have to assume actually that our folks are looking at that information and that's what's informing their understanding of things. So we're going to use our intel briefing from our staff to inform the messaging that we're going to give to our employees, and then of course outward to our clients. As I said before, we need to rely on experts who have experience in whatever field we are struggling with. You may not need a consultant to come in for crisis management. You may need somebody to come in for just one discrete area. So you need to try to identify those early enough. I would recommend that you have a crisis management team assembled. That is a small unit that is able to convene very quickly. It has a very clear reporting and decision-making structure, and it should be empowered to make critical decisions in the absence of a larger consensus. Footnote here, a process that requires consensus on decisions to be made during a crisis will slow the process down. We have to trust our teammates. We have to empower them to make the right decisions. In terms of what we're going to be communicating about, particularly with our employees, few things. Number one, employee needs, right? Our organization can only survive if our employees are able to work and if they're feeling like they want to work and are invested in it. So we're looking at employees' needs. What do they need emotionally? What do they need physically? What are their travel concerns? Remote working logistics, and importantly, business tracking and forecasting. So it's very important to understand the downstream impacts of what is happening now. And so we're not looking at just a month or 2 months or August, as we heard the White House say yesterday. We're looking at 18 months out, 2 years and 3 years. What information do we need to know about how our organization is performing such that we can stay floating and sail through this? And that may also, that information on productivity and where we deploy assets may actually help us identify gaps that we can cover in the market later on and maybe open up new lines of business. We need redundancy in our organization, okay? Silos kill. Silos will absolutely destroy a crisis management effort. We need to share information internally so that our team has appropriate backup in case of an absence. And I'll just use the obvious. If one of us is test positive or has a presumptive case of coronavirus, we can't be in the room, okay? Or maybe we're too sick to work. As I said before, we need to be adaptable. People get very committed to their plans, especially in a crisis when they become insecure. Things change very, very quickly in an emergency. We've got to be able to adjust, to pivot on very short notice, and to be secure enough in our judgment that we can abandon a prior plan entirely. We also want to be creative, okay? This whole thing is forcing us all to become artists in some way. It's not too early to start thinking about how our business and employees, as I said before, may fill gaps in the market and actually create profitability for us later if we're identifying areas that we can service that we hadn't before. And finally, our response and our thinking has to be enterprise focused, right? We cannot just think about one lane of the business. We think about every single lane of the business and how it's impacted by the crisis and how it can help resolve the crisis. And when we are enterprise focused, we are thinking not just about saving our business, making it profitable. We're also thinking about how our business can have a unique impact on the entire economy around us. Okay, we have the ability to influence how other people see things happening in real time simply by our demeanor, and our enterprise is the best emblem of our demeanor. So I usually don't do this. I never actually plug what we do during a presentation, but it's big and it's tough to work through. If I can be of help on the operations side, I work with a team of external crisis response consultants. If things are getting too big and the tidal wave is too high, we're more than happy to assist in managing. So just feel free to reach out and we'll be glad to help. And without further ado, I'm going to have to give it over to Kathy Rubin.
All right. Good morning, everybody. And I want to thank John because it's been so helpful during all of this. I can get sometimes focused in on the weeds, and then John is there to keep us all on the big picture. What's happening? Why is it happening? And what's going to happen next? And how do we deal with it in real time? So I want to start by talking about what's happening on the legal front, because it is changing quickly. And I'll just blow through this very quickly. So we have both emergency state legislation and emergency federal legislation. So the state legislation, if you saw Governor Baker on the TV, you know the broad outlines of it. There have been emergency measures that were announced. We've got educational operations suspended until April 6th. Schools can stay open for meal programs and other non-educational operations, but the kids are all at home from school, and that's going to be important with regard to your workers. Gatherings are limited, gatherings over 25 people. Now, when you read the actual order, does it include a gathering of 25 people within a private workplace? It could. And that's just a safety issue as well. Any confined indoor or outdoor space, faith-based gatherings. So these are prohibited. We've got the ban on eating and drinking establishments. That also goes through April 5th. You can't permit on-premises consumption. And there's additional requirements in Boston. You can't have long lines outside the door and you can be shut down. There's some improvements related to healthcare. You can do telehealth. Much more testing available. The RMV, you're probably asking why this? Well, if you have employees who drive and their license is expired, they're going to have a bit of a grace period. But note that this does not apply to CDLs, commercial driver's licenses. All right, and then here's the biggie, unemployment. The thing you need to know about that is, and this is both due to federal and state developments, unemployment is becoming much more broadly available. If stuff is happening to your workers that causes them to be out of work, encourage them to apply. So unemployment benefits are expanded. Some of the usual stuff that talks about, well, you have to be able to work. No, if you're quarantined, you can get it. If you're exposed, you can get it. If you have to take care of kids, you can get unemployment. There's no more 1 week waiting period. And there's emergency legislation that's been filed on that. So some of this stuff is they're doing it already. Other of this stuff, they're poised to do it due to emergency legislation. But unemployment is a lot broader. So that's the quick rundown of what's happening on the state front. Now, what about the federal front? So we have the House has passed a bill and passed it broadly that is called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And the latest intel, which I got through John with all his terrific contacts, is I learned around 11 o'clock last night that there were some technical corrections to the bill that were worked out in the House. It has now been sent to the Senate, and Mitch McConnell, when asked about it, has said, we're going to sign this thing. So this could be signed very, very soon into law, and it would go into effect 15 days after the date it is formally enacted. So what does this law say? And here, just because we're a little late. My PowerPoint slides may not match exactly what I'm saying, but you will get the gist. All right, so here's the deal. Employers with 1 to 499 employees, that's pretty much everyone on this call, but there may be some with more. If you have 500 employees, this law doesn't apply to you, okay? If 1 to 449, you're gonna have to grant 2 weeks of paid sick time, and you're also gonna have to grant up to 12 weeks of FMLA leave, which after 2 weeks is gonna be paid at 2/3 pay to employees who miss work due to a variety of corona-related public health emergency reasons, like they've been sent home by a public health official or recommended by a doctor to stay home because their physical presence around others could jeopardize health. They have to care for a family member who's in the same boat, and family member is very broadly defined now. We've got domestic partners, we've got, sisters and brothers even. If in those instances, the sisters and brothers, they don't have access to functional needs, they have access or functional issues, or here's another one, to care for your children if school is closed or your regular child care provider, and it's gotta be a paid child care provider, is unavailable. So basically, if you're out of work due to this coronavirus, fairly good chance you're gonna be able to get this leave. So you're all asking the question, well, wait a minute, who's gonna pay for this? How are we gonna pay for this? And the answer is that employers do foot the bill for this, but you get 100% credit on your payroll tax. And there's also some credits available for self-employed persons. So once again, 1 to 149 employees, you're gonna have to provide FMLA leave, you're gonna have to provide paid sick time, but you're gonna get a tax credit, a payroll tax credit. That was real important. They were talking earlier about it being an income tax credit, which wouldn't work for the nonprofits. So this is a good thing. All right, so once again, this is only the employers with 500 or more employees. So you might be saying, oh no, oh my God, there's all this stuff I'm gonna have to worry about now. What? Sorry, I said the wrong word. It's 500 or fewer. It's 490, up to 499 employees. If you have 500 or more, you don't have to worry about this. If you're fewer, even if you've only got just one worker, this applies to you. Now, before you say, oh my God, this is gonna be too difficult, it is not that difficult. It's actually not that long a statute. And if you've dealt with Massachusetts sick leave, you can deal with this. All right. So let's start with just the FMLA part. And it's the usual thing, family and medical leave. Are they eligible? Normally eligibility, you have to work for a year. Under this new law, if they've worked you for 30 days, they get it. Second question, do they meet the requirements? In this crisis, it'd be pretty tough not to. It's not totally clear to what extent you can require a doctor's note, because it's very hard to get doctor's notes these days. But it's a very broad spectrum of employees. If you're eligible, you're gonna get up to 12 weeks. The first 14 days are unpaid, but then it will be paid through the sick time, the separate thing. So the first 14 days are unpaid, and then thereafter it's 2/3 pay. And there's some stuff about how that's determined, like, if you don't have a regular schedule, we'll look at the last 6 months, and if you haven't worked for 6 months, we'll look at the reasonable expectation when you were hired. And just like with the FMLA, the employer's got to hold the employee's position, job restoration. If you've got under the 25 employees and the position goes away due to this crisis, the Secretary of Labor is going to be able to issue some guidelines. You would have to make an effort to bring them back. There's a provision about if you can't bring them back because the position doesn't exist, for up to a year, calling them to let them know if the position opens up. And the Secretary of Labor, and this is key, the regulations are going to be key, can issue regulations, what they say, for good cause, to exclude certain healthcare professionals like EMTs or frontline people. And they can also issue regulations to exclude businesses with fewer than 50 employees. These are all the folks that haven't been subject to FMLA before. If complying with this would jeopardize the viability of the business as a going concern. All right. So once again, every one of you, someone's been employed for more than 30 days, they're going to be able to take this job protected FMLA leave, and it will be paid 2/3 after 2 weeks by you, but you can be reimbursed through tax credits. That's the first part, the FMLA part. Now, the second part is a sick leave part. And again, it looks a lot like some of the state sick leave laws that we've seen. Once again, it's fewer than 500 employees. Now, what can you use it for? The sick leave part phrases it a little bit differently, but it's basically the same deal. If you have to self-isolate due to either symptoms or diagnosis, you have to care for a family member in the same boat, or just regular old child care if the school is closed or the child care provider is unavailable. So what do you get? If you are full-time, you're going to get up to 80 hours or 2 weeks. If you're part-time, you'll get, the pro rata share based on your regular schedule. And once again, there are some provisions for how you figure it out for people with a variable schedule. This is important. This is on top of whatever sick leave the employer already gives, all right? And there's something in there in the law that says you can't change your existing policy because of this new law. You can't say, we used to give sick time, but now that we're going to have to give this additional sick time, we're going to change our policy. You can't change it after the enactment of the law to avoid the law. This sick time is not payable on termination. All of this stuff, I neglected to mention, ends on December 31st, all right? It ends on December 31st, and there's no carryover of this sick time. You can't require people to provide a replacement. And there'll be a poster that the Secretary of Labor is going to give us to put up. Just like with FMLA, there's a non-retaliation provision. So this is important because Pete's going to be talking about furloughs and layoffs. We all know that under the regular FMLA, just because a person's on FMLA leave doesn't mean they can't be laid off, but you can't lay them off because of their FMLA leave. So if you're going through layoffs or furloughs, base it on economic conditions. So this person has the skill set that I need right now. This person is doing a job that is needed right now, not let's just lay off all the folks who are taking time off due to this emergency. That could get you subject to discrimination and retaliation claims. This law also has special provisions for, I know that there's a lot of folks on the phone who may be from Associated Subcontractors of Massachusetts. Welcome to the webinar. And there are some provisions in the law related to multi-employer bargaining units. The long story short is, if there's a multi-employer bargaining unit, you've got an agreement, and the agreement provides for the union to be doing the payments, you can make the payments under this law through that. All right, so that's a whirlwind tour of what's new. We've got new legislation on the horizon, and it's going to be paid for through tax cuts. We have much broader unemployment. And now let's turn the podium, the lectern, the space over to Pete.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pete Moser. I'm a partner here at Hirsch Roberts Weinstein. And boy, what a difference a day makes. I sort of long for the quaint days of last week and a week earlier when we were talking about all the employment laws that might be impacted by coronavirus and whether OSHA was going to issue emergency temporary standards. I know a bunch of senators, including Elizabeth Warren, had written to the Secretary of Labor, keeping an eye on that. Haven't heard a thing about that since. Things have moved pretty quickly. A week or two ago, it was interesting to think and debate about what questions an employer could ask its employees, and could they take employees' temperature, and what if some employee was scared of working due to safety concerns. I mean, these issues are still there. We're going to talk about them a little bit, but boy, I tell you, my telephone consultations with clients have really turned, unfortunately, to this topic of furloughs and layoffs. And, it's been amazing to me to see how many industries are now directly affected and are having to consider furloughs and layoffs. Obviously, the hospitality industry. We see restaurants obviously have been closed. You've got transportation, higher ed, construction projects in Boston have been halted. That affects a lot of businesses. That'll probably be expanded. Even nonprofits are being affected in ways I wouldn't have expected when this started. Community health centers are being affected. There was just a piece on the radio NPR today coming into work talking about that, how elective surgeries are being canceled and the revenue streams of community health centers are being greatly affected. Nonprofit human service providers, special needs schools may be closing despite not having a need to under the law. It's still happening. People aren't sending their family members to the day have programs, group programs, understandably. So this is affecting everybody, and more we're talking about, unfortunately, how to deal with the need to flex down the employment staff. So furloughs and layoffs, here we go. What I've done is tried to sort of frame the discussion around 5 simple questions, and I'll use that as a jumping off point. If we had a live audience, it would have been a heck of an interactive program, but that went by the wayside too along the way, so I'll be talking to myself. But here we go. So in terms of notice, how much notice must I give an affected employee before implementing a layoff or furlough? Well, the short answer is probably you don't have to do that, but there's a little more to it than that. I mean, what the consideration is for starters is the WARN Act. People talk about whether or not the Workers' Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act of 1988 requires us to give 60 days notice. And I think the short answer is going to be no, for a lot of reasons. One, the employer may be smaller than 100 employees. It wouldn't qualify that way. For another, the layoff may be less than 50 employees. It wouldn't qualify that way. Or even if it was, it's not a plant closing and it doesn't affect a third of the workforce. But aside from all that, there are exceptions to the federal WARN Act, the plant closing law, and these are largely embedded into the various state mini WARN Acts as well. And we'd like to believe that some of these exceptions applied, even if you were otherwise falling into the WARN Act requirements. If you were that larger employer, if you did have a major layoff that affected more than 50 people and it was a plant closing or a mass layoff, the exceptions generally include what? Unforeseen business circumstances, natural disaster. I think most employers feel that that's exactly the situation we're facing right now. So I have not seen too many employers, frankly, be overly concerned or feel capable of providing 60 days notice under the WARN Act. And I think we're comfortable that it probably doesn't apply. We don't have the luxury of erring on the side of caution with that, the financial luxury. What other notice provisions might be implicated by implementing a layoff or a furlough? I suppose you could have a collective bargaining agreement. You know, unionized employers on the line know that the first place they would turn if a layoff or a furlough is affecting a unionized workplace is to your CBA. And almost every CBA will have a reduction in force or layoff article, and we would want to follow that. Could there be emergency circumstances that justify an employer sort of unilaterally making a change to its policies or practices that without negotiating? Yeah, I've seen that in rare circumstances on the financial end, but I don't know that we're there yet. And I think most unionized employers at this point will be following their CBA. And that probably only applies to a small fraction of folks on the line here today, since that's just the fraction that's unionized in the private sector workforce. So we'll move on from that. But so far, if you're answering the question, how much notice must I give? Your hands probably aren't tied. It's not going to be the WARN Act 60 days notice for plant closing, most likely. Follow your collective bargaining agreement, individual employment contracts, right? There could be some notice provisions in there terminating a contract. But short of that, I think the maybe more interesting or dangerous question is, how do I select people for a layoff or a furlough? And the usual rules apply. I mean, you can't make selections based on protected class status. And in the present environment, what might that include? Well, if we're trying to pare down to a skeleton crew, the temptation might be to say, hey, I've already got a bunch of people who are out because they're quarantined or maybe even sick. I will obviously include them in the layoff because they're not working now anyway. That would pose a problem. So I have not heard that come up in phone calls. I think the furloughs and layoffs I'm hearing about are frankly much more broad-based than that. But I didn't want to give short shrift to the notion of, hey, if we're talking furloughs and layoffs, selection is still an issue, and the same advice and rules apply there, that there's protection in having documentation about the selection criteria and the business reasons for it and all that. So here's where I would normally say, are there any questions? But we're going to move on. I mean, I hope people are feeling free to type in with questions as they come in. We're trying to identify themes and hit them in real time. But we will be around post-show to deal with questions as well. So
We have just two quickie furlough and layoff related questions I want to run by you. And if folks hopefully can hear me, hopefully I'm loud enough. So one of the questions was, if you furlough employees, are you going to have to provide FMLA or paid sick time? And Pete and I were just debating that question on the phone this morning. It's not yet totally clear. But under the existing FMLA, just because a person is on FMLA leave doesn't mean you can't make non-FMLA related economic decisions. And similarly, if a person is not yet on the leave, or if they're already on the leave, they can still be laid off if their leave had nothing to do with the layoff. Pete, agreed? Or do you think that this action could be very crucial for employers?
So hopefully the audio on that was good. I know when somebody's a little further from the mic, it's tough. The gist of it was essentially question number 2. Does it matter whether I call it a layoff or a furlough? What's the difference? And this is something we've been spending a lot of time thinking about in the last 48 hours since the federal legislation has become pending. So, I mean, let's get into it. It's, as Kathy said, or I hope everybody heard Kathy say, hey, in theory, it shouldn't matter, right? If we're talking about FMLA and the expansion of FMLA rights under the new federal law, that aspect of the FMLA hasn't changed. There's a piece in the regulations in the FMLA that effectively says, look, if you were going to be laid off anyway, the FMLA has always been a shield, not a sword. You can't forestall a layoff that would otherwise have occurred for legitimate reasons. So one, in theory, as Kathy is saying, could take comfort in the fact that, look, I don't need to engage in a permanent separation of my employees. I can afford to do a furlough rather, instead, and feel that I am protected, that if things got bad, I wouldn't be on the hook for 10 weeks of paid leave under this new FMLA provision. I think that's true in the abstract. I think that's I could point to the regulation that would say why that's true. I will say this, though, that we are certainly in, I don't want to say desperate times, but dramatic times where everybody is acting in an abundance of caution. And if clients are wondering whether it makes a difference, as per question 2, to call it a layoff or a furlough, well, there is one right there. I mean, a layoff is a clear break in employment, and that would leave one not to have to worry about FMLA rights. It's just the way it is. A furlough situation, you've got somebody that's still your employee and that's still able to exercise or give you notice that they're exercising FMLA rights. And then if you let that person go after the notification, is it retaliation? Is it because of the notification, or is it simply a layoff that would have happened anyway? And you've got that gray area. So question number 2 to me is all about this issue. Does it matter whether I call it a layoff or a furlough? It does for some things. I think this is the biggest thing that we will all have to put some thought to, and that is a consideration. Whether these new paid leave rights that the federal government is going to be rolling out, whether they're really affected by whether we call this a layoff or a furlough. And that'll be something on an individual basis to consider. Other than that, one question is, what does it matter if I call it a layoff or a furlough? Well, the final paycheck, I suppose. If you separate somebody's employment in Massachusetts by way of involuntary discharge, you got to give the employee their final pay, including accrued vacation time. In a furlough situation, I think we are comfortable that that's not a discharge. That's not a permanent separation that requires the payout of accrued time. Layoff would be different. Prior to this federal law, I would have said that why does it matter if I call it a layoff or a furlough was for the optics and the operational piece of it. It would, again, a week ago, it would have been better to say, listen, if you want to keep people connected to the company, everybody is hoping that we'll be resuming operations shortly. We don't need to have a permanent separation and have people maybe lose people. Why not call it a furlough and put a time period on it at which we can say, look, we're going to reassess this. So that, I think, still is the prime consideration. But these new federal laws are now something we got to talk about. And Kathy's point, hopefully it doesn't change things, but I understand why it's something that employers are going to consider. The rest of it, though, does it change unemployment? Does it matter whether I call it a layoff or a furlough for unemployment purposes? No, it doesn't. And the new changes to the unemployment eligibility requirements really make that clear. Does it matter for COBRA purposes? No, it really doesn't. I mean, if you lose your insurance eligibility due to a reduction in hours, whether that's a layoff or a furlough, insurance could be continued through COBRA. And does it matter for WARN notice, even if we were worried about WARN notice? No. I mean, a layoff or a furlough of less than 6 months doesn't count. So by and large, there's your answer to number 2 as best we can give it. I really do think that the huge asterisk is on the new federal law. And it's hopefully not a determining factor, but it's in the mix at this point. So one of the things we did, and I'll try and zip through the rest of what I got because I don't want to take up everybody else's time, was unfortunately we're assisting or helping draft a lot of furlough letters these days. And, one size does not fit all, but I put together sort of a dozen features that you see throughout in nearly every one. So I'm happy to show that slide next and sort of walk through that. Outline of a furlough letter. Here's kind of how they look. Usually it starts with an introduction, to express appreciation for the employee's service and the concern, obviously, for the safety and well-being, and explaining why this is being done. Number 2, you're acknowledging that the situation is fluid and things are subject to change, and here's how you will be notified going forward. 3, if it's a furlough we're talking about, and that's a lot of what I'm seeing, is, you're being clear as to what the employee status is. And as I say, I like putting an end date on it. And this is doubly so now that the federal law may be going into effect in 15 days. If I was having a furlough rather today, I think I would be very clear in saying, this is a 2-week temporary furlough. We're going to reassess the situation in 2 weeks, at which point we'll make a decision and you'll be notified as to whether there's going to be a partial or total recall, or an extension of the furlough, or transition to layoff status. That's number 3. And that would help me feel comfortable that at least I've hedged my bets and put in a placeholder that before this federal law comes into effect, I may be, I can have a second look at my business needs and it may turn into a layoff. And I'll be protected from a retaliation claim or confusion that way. So that's a big one, number 3. 4 is obviously address compensation issues. You got to be clear about that. That's what people are going to be wondering. 5 is performance of work. This is something that might get overlooked, but shouldn't. If it's an unpaid furlough, people are not supposed to be working, and therefore you're not paying people, you should clearly instruct employees that no work is to be performed while on furlough and be insistent about it. That includes the emails and the texts and all that, because non-exempt employees would need to get paid for work time, and exempt employees might need to get paid a salary for the full week if they're doing any work. And all that remote stuff is work. So you really want to build your protection and clearly instruct employees in the furlough letter about not doing work. Number 6, unemployment. We've talked a little bit about that. It's encouraging employees to apply. They frankly should be getting it, though we can't promise it. And you provide the link to the DUA information, how to apply, to the normal pamphlet, things like that. Address benefits, obviously, especially health insurance. Whether I see a lot of companies that are continuing to pay the premiums during the furlough period, but that's some logistics that need to be addressed. And if it's COBRA, it's treated like any other COBRA notice. And then, the rest, notify the company of changes. And if you get sick, that still applies. You're still an employee if you're on furlough. We need to know if you happen to come down with this illness or tested positive or in quarantine, because that might affect what we need to do vis-a-vis employees you might have come in contact with. So that's still part of the messaging. I like providing resources, links to the CDC. That's still the definitive resource. And there's a lot of good links to be given, whether it's in terms of coronavirus symptoms, their recommendations, their updates, all that kind of stuff. Gathering personal belongings could be a situation where people are like, whoa, this came out of nowhere. I just got a lot of stuff at work. How am I supposed to get that back? We don't want a crowd of people coming to get their stuff. So those logistics could be relevant. Don't overlook that. And 11 and 12 are just sort of the wrap up. Make sure we tell employees how and when they can expect to hear from us, who they should be calling with questions. And I think the strong finish for style points is the optimism for the future and the reiteration of appreciation and concern for staff, and hopefully sending as strong a message as John and others have said today. We'll get through this. And we still view everybody as part of the team. So that's a quick run through of sort of the bones of a furlough letter. Other questions that I had put on my outline, we can talk about quickly. In a furlough situation, do I need to pay out an employee's unused accrued time? I think I covered that. I don't think in a furlough situation you do. If you look at state law, Chapter 149, Section 148, it does talk about discharge, and we would take the view that a furlough, at least up to a point, at least if it's delineated by a number of weeks and doesn't go on and on and on, should not be viewed as a discharge. At some point, I think it becomes one. And so that if people have accrued time, they're owed it. And I wouldn't play games with that. I just think that we can temporarily avoid that decision if it's a furlough. What if an employee on furlough ends up performing some work for the company? For example, responding to periodic emails or texts. Yep, we talked about that a little bit. Work time is paid time. And we still have an obligation to track hours of work for non-exempt employees. Maybe it's a more interesting question for salaried exempt employees, because if you're the one telling the salaried exempt employee not to be at work, they are entitled to full salary for the week if they perform any work during that week. And salaried exempt professionals, non-exempts will too. They will work. I mean, they'll be answering emails. They want to help. That's what employees do. So if people are going on unpaid furlough, you really need to be clear that, hey, you are not to do any work. Let's see, lastly, what if instead of a furlough or layoff, I decide to reduce hours? That's obviously an option people are thinking about. Can I reduce an exempt employee's salary commensurate with the hours reduction? Short answer is yes, you can. You got to do things prospectively. In calmer times, this issue comes up, and the Department of Labor has been pretty clear about that too. It can be prospective, and these things happen for a variety of reasons. Communication is clear. It's got to be over the $684 threshold for an exempt employee if you want to continue to treat them as exempt, but it is legal and possible to have an hours reduction, even a dramatic one, and to reduce an exempt employee's salary commensurate with that, as long as it's prospective going forward. So that is it. Are we still on track for time? Hopefully. Charlotte and Julie will be up next to talk.
We're getting a lot of questions coming up, and we'll try to, in some instances, we're answering them in real time through the speakers, but we'll also stick around at the end, so keep them coming.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Charlotte Patilla. I'm an attorney here at Hirsch Roberts Weinstein, and I'm joined by Julia Russo, our dedicated co-op. We're here to talk to you a little bit about how you can keep your workplace safe, and also what to do if employees can't make it to work or shouldn't be at work. So without further ado, we're just going to hop in.
So as far as medical screenings or taking an employee's temperature, the EEOC does consider measuring someone's temperature a medical exam, which will trigger the Americans with Disabilities Act to apply. This means we think that employers probably can require employee temperatures to be taken because a pandemic flu does pose a direct threat to the workplace. However, there are some restrictions on that you definitely want to be mindful of. The CDC and state and local health authorities have determined that COVID-19 is severe, meaning that this provides objective evidence that this disease does pose a direct threat to the workplace. First, all medical screenings need to be conducted in a non-discriminatory manner. This means that every employee within the same job category must be subjected to the same screening procedures. Also, employers should really be careful to protect employee privacy. This means that all medical exam screening measures need to be kept confidential. All of the files should be maintained on separate forms. And also, we just want people to be aware that someone with COVID-19 may not have a temperature and may not be symptomatic. They still can be carriers of this virus.
And just to follow up on that, I think employers want to be sensible about when they're going to bring out a thermometer and test an employee for their temperature. I think a lot of folks are, to the extent they can, striving to enable telework. And for certain circumstances, like in the healthcare setting, in an adult care facility or an adult day program, it definitely makes sense to take temperatures. Whereas when you're in an office environment and you may be one of two people in the office, maybe it doesn't make so much sense to take a temperature. So sort of just a reminder, I think that most people do not relish the thought of having to take their employees' temperatures, but if you do, just be sensible about it. So moving on, what if someone refuses to work, Julia?
So under OSHA, the main standard that will likely apply is the general duty clause for employers, meaning that employers have a duty to ensure that the workplace is free from recognized hazards that could lead to substantial physical harm or death. This means that you definitely want to be mindful of requests from employees to have protective gear, or for example, if they raise a direct concern about someone that is sick in the workplace and how that might affect their health or other employees' health. You definitely want to be mindful of those concerns. So also on the OSHA website, which will be on the list of links that we will be distributing after this presentation, they have decided to measure the exposure risks of each workplace. So it goes from low to very high. We suggest that you be mindful of the exposure risk of your workplace and how those guidelines might apply to you. And also, if an employee does refuse to work, that in order to gain protection under OSHA in particular, that refusal must be made in good faith because they genuinely believe an imminent danger exists in the workplace. And this is a reasonable person standard. So another reasonable person would agree with that assessment. We also think that refusals to work could be protected concerted activity under the National Labor Relations Act. So be mindful about that, especially if an employee is expressing concerns about their fellow coworkers. Most importantly, we just want to remind everyone that if someone does express concerns about working, we should definitely engage in dialogue with them, find out what their concerns are and why, how we can respond to those, especially if the employee discloses that they have an underlying health condition, which would make their workplace maybe even more riskier. Just converse with them, and as a lot of us have talked about, there's a lot of anxiety and stress going on right now. So we all are in the same boat. We all want the same thing for everyone to be healthy.
Yep, and I think that point is really important. I think that the exceptions that would allow an employee to lawfully refuse to work are somewhat narrow, and that really the important piece is going to be making sure that there's open channels of communication between the employer and the employee so that the employer can appreciate what the employee's concerns are and see if there are other measures short of the employee not working that would allay the employee's concerns. We did receive a question about, well, what happens if somebody takes a voluntary unpaid leave during this time? That's really going to be up to the employer, and the employers have a lot of discretion in that area. They don't, and I don't think we would recommend that they guarantee reinstatement, but if you want to promulgate a temporary unpaid voluntary leave policy, employers are free to do that. I think you want to build in enough flexibility to make sure that whatever the policy is in terms of reinstatement rights, if you will, the employer says, we will make reinstatement decisions based on our business needs, which are constantly changing. The goal really should be to reinstate somebody, but there may be situations in which somebody is not in a position to reinstate somebody and needs somebody to perform the employee's job right then and there.
Yeah. Also, as a practical matter, we definitely suggest to contact counsel before imposing any discipline during this time concerning any of these issues.
Good point. So let's move on to question 3. When should an employer send someone home or ask an employee not to report to work due to a health-related concern?
So we also, on the links that we will be distributing, there's many links to the CDC website, which we suggest everyone checks out periodically. Things change very rapidly, as we've seen. And as of now, according to the CDC, all persons in the US should be avoiding non-essential travel to places with widespread ongoing transmission. Definitely refer to the CDC website for the list of countries that this applies to. I know that it just changed in the past 24 hours to be global, I believe. And so as a result, employers can ask employees that have traveled to those risky areas to quarantine for 14 days after returning, just in order to assess if they develop any symptoms of COVID-19. However, we should not restrict employees from work just because they have relatives abroad. Unless there is a reasonable risk of exposure to COVID-19. We just want to be aware of any discriminatory actions, and we should also just be sure that no employee is being targeted because of their race, national origin, or ancestry. However, if the employee is sick, if they are showing symptoms of contagious illnesses, even if they have not been tested for COVID-19, we can restrict them from the workplace. Again, this is gonna go along with other employees, coworkers' concerns, just keeping the workplace safe. We also strongly encourage employers to implement social distancing practices at this point, because both the federal and state government has suggested those practices. Telework is strongly encouraged. We realize that it may not be possible for all employers to implement telework at this time. However, we definitely suggest that all should be planning about how much work can feasibly be done remotely on a long-term basis, just in order to plan ahead and reduce the risk of exposure as much as possible.
All right, thank you. All right, so what are an employer's obligations if an employee is sent home or asked not to report to work? I think that in general, sort of what Julia alluded to is correct. We want to sort of divide people into buckets. If they are sick, that's one bucket. If they are in some kind of quarantine or prophylactic social distancing measure, that's a different bucket. So if they're sick, under Massachusetts law, they have a right to up to 40 hours of earned sick time. It will depend on your policies, whether they get those sick days at the beginning of the calendar year, if they accrue it going forward. But if employees have the sick time, they can use it for this if they are actually sick. There might be a possibility that some employees will qualify for FMLA leave now. That's if they have COVID-19 and it is sort of like the flu, but there are complications that arise with it. So normally what the DOL has told us is that the flu by itself, the ordinary flu, is not going to be a serious health condition. The regulations for the FMLA say that a serious health condition is really defined as one of two things. It's either a health condition involving inpatient care, or it could be a health condition involving continuing treatment. That typically involves a visit to the doctor and a continuing regimen of treatment. So if you go to the doctor and you get antibiotics because you have COVID-19, that might qualify as a serious health condition. The other alternative is if 2 visits to the doctor in a 30-day period. That's what sort of the regulations envision when they're talking about continuing treatment for purposes of determining whether somebody has a serious health condition. And as we mentioned earlier, if it's traditional FMLA, I think you're gonna have to still meet all the eligibility requirements to get that leave. So having worked 1,250 hours in the past 12 months and being employed by an employer who has 50 or more employees in a 75-mile radius. The third thing you might want to consider for somebody that's not FMLA eligible is whether there are obligations under the ADA. Now, the ADA has a similar take, which is that normal ordinary flu is not going to be a disability. I think in the context of COVID-19, what we're talking about are people who are in that that category of people who have a very adverse reaction to COVID-19, that 16 to 20% of people who are being hospitalized and have really serious symptoms and conditions related to COVID-19. Generally speaking, though, the flu by itself is not going to be a disability that triggers an employer's obligations under the ADA to provide a reasonable accommodation, for example. So let's talk a little bit about folks that are not sick. If they're not sick, again, the employer has a lot of discretion. So people that are sent home on a prophylactic quarantine, they probably cannot, under most policies, use their sick time, but employers should consider loosening their sick time policies to allow employees to use their sick time during this period. And I think if you do that, you want to be clear with the employees that just because they're being permitted to use their sick time at this point does not mean that they are going to continue to earn sick time in excess of what the policy currently provides for, unless that's something the employer wants to do. So for example, if somebody has 40 hours of Massachusetts earned sick time and they were exposed to somebody that recently traveled to Europe, and the employer says, I want you to sit out for 14 days at home, and you can't work from home because of the nature of our services, the employer could say, listen, even though you're not sick and we're taking this precautionary measure, I'm going to let you use your sick time, but you need to know that I'm not going to provide you additional sick time just because you're using it for the quarantine. So it's something to consider for employers. Some employers, because they're trying to strike the right balance between workplace and employee safety and health and well-being and their business needs, are actually going ahead and paying for those prophylactic quarantines. If your organization can afford to do that, that's something you should consider. If another option I think we talked about a little bit before was if there isn't a paid a way for them to get paid through one of your policies, or you're an employer that's not in the position to provide paid leave at this time, they can consider applying for unemployment. Ultimately, it will be up to the Department of Unemployment to determine whether they are eligible for benefits. So if there is no paid leave available, they should consider applying for unemployment. Finally, we talked a little bit about this before, there's no obligation to restore those folks who are out on a prophylactic quarantine to their prior positions, but I think that that generally is the goal of most employers, is to restore people to their positions. So while you want to make sure that you are doing what you need to do to protect your business and meet your business needs, I think ultimately the goal for most employers in this position is to restore somebody at the end of 14 days. Very quickly, what about vacation policies? Employers should consider loosening the notification requirements and allowing people to use vacation if they're out because, for example, their schools are closed and somebody needs to care for their children, or if they're out on this prophylactic quarantine, or for other reasons. In terms of advancing vacation time, I often counsel employers not to do it. If you're going to do it, I suggest you reach out to counsel and see if you can get a form so that you can put everything in writing to make sure that you and the employer are on the same page about how any advance for vacation time or paid time off is going to work. All right, what should employers do before an employee who has been out due to a health-related concern returns to work? Ask for a fitness of duty certification. However, you should be flexible here because providers are likely going to be overwhelmed. Some of them are not seeing folks in person anymore, just via telemedicine. And so we think you're going to need to be flexible about how you get this documentation and certification and whether you need it.
The CDC is taking the position that if someone is asymptomatic, they're only out because of exposure, they would appreciate if employers did not require a fitness for duty certificate because the healthcare systems are getting overwhelmed. But conversely, if the person has actually been diagnosed with COVID-19, then you want to make sure that that there is a medical professional who concludes the person is safe to be working.
All right, without further ado, we're going to turn this over to Dr. Cedar. Thank you.
While Dr. Cedar's coming over, just wanted to let folks know, I know we're getting a lot of questions and we'll hang around at the end to answer as many questions as we can.
Good morning. My name is Bruce Cedar. I'm from CMG Associates, and pleased to be here this morning to join in this discussion. When we get to the slides, I'm going to skip over a lot of parts of this. When I started writing this 3 weeks ago, it was a very different world, and I thought I would be providing you with information which most of you have been inundated with over the last 3 weeks and already know most of it. So we'll try to focus on the more important things which have to do with anxiety and how to deal with as leaders in your organizations, what you should be doing to sort of calm the waters. All right, I'm gonna. Okay, so first of all, what do we know about COVID-19? We know a lot. All of you are experts on it at this point because you've watched enough cable news to know everything that has to be known. But it's a novel virus. We have no immunity. We know what the symptoms are. And we know that about 80% of the people will recover from this illness. But some people will get very ill. I'm going to skip over the transmission. We sort of know how this is done, and that's why we've moved to social distancing and really staying away from people, from self-quarantining. The more important thing that I'm going to talk about is what is the transmission of fear, because this is what people are dealing with at this point in terms of the social contagion. And again, things have happened extremely quickly. We've had this sort of slow burn in the sense that, we've all been watching, and we go back, 2.5, 3 months, and we saw this thing happen in China and other parts of the world. We paid attention to it, but we had a certain amount of denial. Oh, that's happening there. It's not going to really happen here. But then within the last week, what we've really seen is how this has really accelerated, and we're already behind the curve. And now things are being done to mitigate the virus and to try to control it. But that means that we're taking these very extreme steps that are hoping to slow the growth of the virus. And to also, as they say, flatten out the curve so that people are not overwhelming the healthcare system. But what that means is also that there's a lot of anxiety that people have that gets transmitted and it also happens through social media. And people are looking for sources of information that they can trust, and that often is very difficult. There are a lot of things that are coming over social media or even through email from friends that is really just misinformation. And you have to really evaluate the information carefully. I suggest sticking to the healthcare sites, the CDC and public health, to get information. We all know about the hygiene advice, and I'm sure that everybody is washing their hands and using hand sanitizer and so forth, and social distancing. We know that we have to social distance because we're moving much more toward lockdown now. So the question, what should you be doing as a company? John started off talking about some of the things that we should be doing and that we should have done it before. So we're really in the situation now where the things that I have on this slide are things that hopefully you've already been doing and are working off of and will continue to do. But we are all planning in the midst of a crisis now because we probably reached the point where we've been confronted with parts or we're confronted with actions that we need to respond to, and it's not contained in the plan that we've already put together. But you should be thinking about, where is your redundancy in your organization? How are you going to take care of things when individuals aren't there to do the job? How are you going to send people home? All of these things are part of your continuing operations plan. And this is really important as leaders that you're stepping up and really working on this. Your emergency response team, this should be the people in your company. It could also include outside consultants that you want to bring in to help you make these decisions, like the legal expertise that you're getting in this room, to help you decide how to move forward on some of these things. We're also looking at what data do you need to consider. Some of this, again, is out of date. We're beyond, looking at whether it's, you have an identifiable contact or community spread. It's just we've reached a point where it's happening so quickly that that we're acting on it, and we're doing social isolation, we're shutting down businesses, and so we're in a different state at this point. But as a company, and when we've talked about, when people get sick, so you've heard some of the legal things. I'm going to take it from a sort of a community. Your organization is a community. And hopefully within that community that we're not only looking out for ourselves, but we're also looking out for the community as a whole. And one of the things that's necessary is that when people are feeling ill, that we are in fact looking to take care of the community as well as ourselves. So it's important to report that information so that the community can make decisions on what to do. This gets into this line where what's privacy, what's covered in terms of private information. But I think that from the standpoint of if someone is not well, and it doesn't matter why they're not well, if someone is not well, the community would like to know that information because it influences decisions that get made down the road. So somebody who has symptoms of something and may spread them, if the other people in the community know that, they can make decisions about maybe I should limit whether I go visit my parents this weekend or things like that, because we want to also take care of higher risk populations and not spread the illness if we have been potentially exposed to it. Every organization needs a communication strategy. So how do we begin to talk about this? How do we know, how do employees know what we're doing at this point? How do they get the information that they need so that they can move forward? So, I have things in here like a new communication is, just as we're moving from being a society that shakes hands to a society that bumps elbows, that it's important to, maybe make those things clear. If you're still open and you have people coming into your office, put up a sign so that they know that you're not being rude, but that you just don't do this. And this is just prudent. Make sure that you're taking the steps to make sure that your environment continues to be safe. But you want to be communicating to your employees, what the policies are. So all of the things that have been presented today about furloughing or sick pay or all of those things, these are the things that you want to be communicating to your employees, because this is where their anxiety is right now. They want to know what's happening next and if they're going to be covered. Are they going to continue to be paid? All of these are big questions. You also want to make sure that you're, as we've talked about before, having discussions about your travel policy and maybe even communicating where people have traveled to. So again, you can make good decisions about things. You want to make clear expectations about what remote working is like and what your expectations of them are. And you want to be checking in with them regularly as they're working from home. And you want to create channels for open communication so that questions, they know they can pop up and they can be answered at any time. But your ERT may want to send out a morning memo or something like that to keep people informed of what's happening and or what's changed overnight.
Hey, Bruce?
Yes.
Two things. One, as you go into psychological immunity, maybe you can touch on how everybody's going to recover from the breaking news that Tom Brady just announced he's leaving the Patriots. And I'm not even kidding. For those of you that are glued to the set, you might have missed that update. Tom Brady's leaving. But more to the point here, I know, Bruce, that your organization provides like a full range of EAP services, and even in a furlough situation that I was talking about, people still have access to benefits. People still have that EAP benefit. A lot of their vacation, accruals may stop or PTO, but that EAP benefit is still there. How do you, in this environment with the social distancing, I mean, what is happening on that front? And by the way, so it might be a good idea for employers to remind absent employees on furlough or working from home that benefit is still there. But how does it work?
So absolutely. So for companies that have employee assistance programs, we are adapting in the moment. Also, I mean, a lot of the things that we have done have often been through one-to-one appointments in somebody's office. At this point, that's changing, and in fact, the laws are being relaxed so that where Skyping or using Zoom for sessions has been Not the practice of a lot of therapists, but now we're beginning to use those more and more. And in fact, our organization, in fact, has those capabilities. And we also have a 24-hour call center where people can call at any time and just talk on the phone to somebody. So, so those are in place and are available as people are feeling anxious or have questions about how to deal with things. And there are a lot of questions that come up also about, all right, how do I work at home and also take care of these kids that all of a sudden are home? And that can be very difficult. And so there are opportunities to talk to somebody and get suggestions about those things as well. And to answer Pete's question, I have no idea how to deal with the anxiety of Tom leaving. Just not there yet. The circle here and in the middle are sort of all the things that we have that are, our fears, our panics, our shock, our weakness and helplessness, our anxiety. So these are all things that we contain inside of ourselves. And then they get triggered in some way by the things that happen externally. So if we look on the outside of the circle, we have the suddenness of this. So again, things have turned over in 48 to 72 hours, so that we've gone from something that was distant and we could look at and say, okay, we have 5 cases in Massachusetts, or we have 150 cases in Massachusetts. Oh, they're confined to Biogen, or, but now all of a sudden we're closing down. We're rolling up the sidewalks. We're not going to work. So these are all things. So it's sudden and now it's hitting. And we're starting to think about all the other things that begin to happen as we see our stock market crash, we move into recession, and we start to worry about what the impact of all of that is. So the suddenness is one thing. The variability, there's been a lot of volatility over the last couple of weeks, so that we keep going from, this is really terrible to maybe it's getting better to it's terrible again. So it's been extremely difficult in that week. There's a high frequency of changes. It's complex. So there's a lot of information. There are a lot of rumors that are out there. And again, it's sifting that information and looking for what you pay attention to and what you just exclude. That becomes difficult. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and it's an emergency. We know that now we have moved into a place where, with the actions that are being taken, which are unprecedented, this becomes really real. So what's the impact of that? People can go from, I'm in shock, I have suspicions about things. They can feel a collapse. They can feel despair, real anxiety. People, can have anxiety, and that's difficult enough to live with. What begins to happen, though, is that anxiety over time can sort of settle into depression, where you just, you feel more hopeless, and it's more difficult to deal with the day-to-day things that are going on. So those are the things that's sort of triggering a stress response. I'm going to take a minute on the brain just to sort of think about how does this really begin to happen in our command center. So if you look at the part of the brain, which is the instinct, which is really our brainstem, this is where this is our primitive part of the brain. And basically, this is the part of the brain that we always react to when there's some kind of trauma that hits. So, for example, if we're exposed to some disaster, a hurricane or a tornado, we have instant responses that put us into survival mode, and that's the primitive brain that's reacting. We have less of that in this situation. But we're moving to the middle, which is the feeling part of the brain, which is the limbic system. And this is the emotional part of the brain. So this is where our fears are and our anxieties and so forth. And the larger part of the brain on the top is the neocortex, which is really our cognitive part of the brain. And that's where we do all of our analytical thinking, where that's a rational part of our brain, but it can also be irrational at times. But what can happen in a situation like this, where things are changing quickly, the emotional part of the brain can hijack the cognitive part of the brain, so that in fact, you're running on emotion. and your brain is so overwhelmed, our system is so overwhelmed that we lose the ability to really be rational and to think rationally. And so that's one of the things that we're concerned about, because it can influence the way that we begin to make decisions. Because we've just closed off that part of ourselves to slow things down and think rationally. So what happens? What do we feel like when we have extreme fear and anxiety? It can be fatigue. It can be sort of this dizziness, this tightening of the chest. We can also, feel stomach pains. We have disrupted sleep. And an appetite dysregulation. We can get sort of cranky, all things that would be expected. On overload, when our system is completely overloaded, we have compulsive tendencies, we can have suspicions, emotional delay, loss of trust, snapping up and hoarding. This is the explanation for why there is no toilet paper in the stores. We can have emotional outbursts. So as leaders, what is it that you want to be doing? You want to be helping people feel that they have a sense of control in all of this. So this is difficult in this day and age because we have information overload, and it's difficult to recognize, misinformation. But as a leader, you can reassure by demonstrating that you take it seriously. Employees want to know that you have a plan, that you've thought about this, that you're moving forward on things, that you're taking care of them. Those are all the things that they want to hear. And they want to be, you really need to address the things that they're most anxious about. So managers need to be proactive, be mindful of signs of concerns, be conscious of your own responses. We'll get to a little bit more of that later, and be prompt at addressing misinformation. So how resilient are your people? Basically, we are extremely resilient, but we can also, as our emotional, if we just talked about, our emotional brains can sort of hijack the system, and we can get a little bit out of control sometimes. But the opportunity for leaders, it really starts with trust. And what research recently has shown that, in fact, employees trust their leadership and their organizations more than they trust the media or the government. So this is an opportunity for leaders to stand up and to really help them through a difficult time. So it's important that that we recognize that every employee plays a part in this ecosystem, and so that we want to make sure that that employees are making decisions with the right part of their brain and not getting hijacked. We also know that we've already moved into this place beyond panic and anxiety, where we have real disruption in the business world, so that we already have travel bans, we already have work from home, our supply chain is disrupted. So this has already impacted the business, but we hope that we can stay agile in these times to be able to make adaptations. This slide should really say we're all wired to go negative. It's not just employees who are wired to go negative. But what I mean by that is, again, that it's easy for negativity to snowball, and that as leaders, we want to practice and enforce sort of a realistic positivity. And what I mean by that is that we want to tell the truth, but we want to try to really to say it in a way that is not negative. We always want to offer hope, and that there's a way that we're going to get through this. And that really has to do with, even if we can't control the situation, we can control how we're responding to it. Sorry about that. So that really means that I should already be through this, so I'll go really quick. So it's imperative for leaders to really begin to model and to help with the mindset. So here are 5 practices that leaders can practice. Keep your emotions in check. As a leader, you set the tone. Be calm and really panic in private.
Panicking, I like that.
So you just don't want to show it. Hype and misinformation can cause panic. We want to make sure that that you're paying attention and that you're able to correct some of the misinformation. There's a lot of sensationalism in the media and social media. Take an active role in addressing overreactions and alarmist behavior and fear-mongering. Remind staff that information doesn't equal informedness, and provide regular informed updates to staff to prevent assumptions being made. Be realistic, provide, as I just said, provide employees with information, and then cautiously positive messages are helpful. Remain realistic. Again, we just talked about how we can so easily go negative, so it's important to be realistic. And also, you know, you might try to say, okay, this is the worst case scenario, this is the best case scenario, try to end up someplace in the middle. And determine the steps that you want to take this. So show that you have a plan so that you can help people feel better about that. Adaptability is key. You want to be, again, we're trying to work smart. Everybody is trying new things now, so that we're in the process of work from home. And this is going to take some time to get used to, because for many organizations, that's not something that's been possible before. So, you know, make sure that you're staying in touch with your staff. Even the people that are home now, check in with them, listen to them, acknowledge their emotions, ask them how they're doing, how they're coping, what's working, what's not working, and ensure that they have support. And again, make sure that they're aware of the resources that you as an organization can be offering them. Encourage empathy. So what we mean by that is being able to put yourself in their shoes. Listen. Don't say that you have a fix for everything, but you know, make sure that you start by making sure that you understand what they're going through. And then lastly, empower your people. Give them agency, and help them by promoting self-care, discussing the challenges as a team. Create a sense of well-being. And I'll close with a quote. A lot of this information came from a recent Forbes article by Jan Bruce. And she ends with, when it comes to uncertainty, I can't read my own quote because it's blocked off. It may not always, it may not always be. The quote's there in the slide. There we go. When it comes to uncertainty, we may not always be able to control the outcome, but we can control our response to it, and that is resilience. It gives you the tools to bounce back from the situations and thrive in the face of challenge. So thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Cedar. So what's going to happen now is we're going to stick around a little bit past our official end time to answer some questions. To make this happen, I'll sit at the keyboard, but what we'll do, some disclaimers. Okay, the first thing is that the new federal law has not yet passed. And we anticipate that it's going to be approved by the Senate and be signed pretty soon, but it hasn't yet passed. The second disclaimer is that the answer to any question is going to depend on an employer's unique situation. For example, what states they're in, what their own policies say, how many employees they have. So we'll give some general answers, but consult with your counsel for the specifics. And then the other disclaimer is that this situation is constantly evolving. So folks in this room may not even agree on what the right answer is. So what'll happen is we'll read a question, we'll answer, and then we'll ask the brain trust, does everybody sort of agree with the answer? And the questions are coming. So let's just start. I'm just going to start my best to read and answer some of them, and we'll make sure everybody agrees. All right. So when's the federal law supposed to go into effect? The Senate needs to sign it and then to approve it, and then President Trump needs to sign it, and then there are 15 days before it goes into effect. The Secretary of Labor is empowered to issue regulations. They have to create a poster, so more information is coming. We can all read the law itself, but sometimes the devil's a little bit in the details. So that's the first answer to that. Okay, so I'm having, all right, so here's another one. Can we tell persons who are over 60 that they must go home? The answer to that is no, because that would be age discrimination. And besides, you could have someone who's 25 who's got someone at home with a compromised immune system. You might have someone who's 30 who themselves has a compromised immune system. The focus should be on safety. And I really like both Dr. Cedar and John saying that, you know, we lawyers are debating about what does the EEOC say? Think big picture. Number one, be safe. Number two, be emotionally aware. And number three, get intel. And that's where all your sources, your lawyers, your consultants, et cetera, can come in to help you figure out. All right, so far everybody agree with the answers? All right. If an intern's job can only be done in the office and the company transitions to work from home, does this mean we're terminating their employment? As Pete said, you're going to have options. One option is to allow them to take an unpaid leave of absence, otherwise known as a furlough. Another option is to permanently separate their employment, but either option they can be able to apply for unemployment. You know, what type of intern it is and how they're along with their working may make a difference. All right? Okay. Pete, you had a question, a comment?
Oh, no, keep going.
Keep going.
Yeah.
All right. If you ask someone to self-quarantine for 14 days, do you pay them full salary or is it workers' comp? Is it workers' comp? The short answer to is it workers' comp is it's not workers' comp unless they contracted it in the connection with their employment. So if there's a healthcare worker and they get exposed, it's workers' comp. If they happen to be your employee and they happen to get sick and you can't tie it to their work, then it's not workers' comp. So not workers' comp.
And I will say this, having talked to some workers' comp insurance experts, it was impressed upon me, again, this is a week ago, so times have changed, but I got the strong sense that the workers' compensation insurance industry didn't intend to shoulder the financial burden of the coronavirus, and they were going to take a close look at causation. And their exact words, and I've seen this repeated, you know, across the country on websites, was as the spread increases from coronavirus, even for that healthcare scenario, even where it's part of your job, that exposure is an occupational risk, they are going to ask the employee to prove causation. And as this disease spreads, it will be harder and harder to prove that. So it was sort of a sobering moment to hear these insurance folks sort of remind us of the need for causation and how that will get trickier as time moves on, and they're serious about it. But that was my takeaway. I encourage anybody else to weigh in.
Pete sort of alluded to this, but the other issue is that it has to be a danger that's inherent to their work, is what was impressed upon us. So healthcare workers may be exposed to coronavirus, but perhaps sitting in a law conference room with a bunch of lawyers, that is not a danger inherent in our work and would not be covered by workers' comp, assuming they could surmount the causation barrier.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody heard the beginning of that. Our microphones are limited to the computer microphone capabilities, but it's really got to arise from your work and be an occupational hazard. And if you drill down into the Massachusetts workers' comp statute, you would see illness being referenced, but it's really got to be that occupational hazard, which is the frontline healthcare workers, but then it comes to causation. Yeah.
All right, so the sub part of that question was, well, do we pay their salary? And this was, as Dave Wilson is fond of saying, it depends. It depends on how you're treating other people. It depends on what your policies say. But long story short, if this new federal legislation goes through, and it likely will, there will be paid sick time available for people who are self-quarantining, and paid at 2/3 pay FMLA available. And in most instances, they will be able to apply for unemployment.
It looks like there may be caps on what they can get for their paid leave.
Yes, good point, Charlotte, that this new legislation does have some caps related to the tax credit, and also related to what they can get. All right, so what questions have we not gotten? All right. Are benefits retained in furloughs versus layoffs? The short answer is if your employee has been permanently severed, they've been fired, your health insurance carrier does not let you just keep them on the plan. But if an employee is in some kind of a leave status or a furlough status, chances are good that they are, but you need to check with your carrier and under the terms of your plan as to whether so-called inactive employees are eligible.
And as for other benefits, one of the things we mentioned was, the EAP benefit is an interesting one that obviously does continue. And that's good to remind people about, although the remote aspect of it gets a little tricky. But other benefits, hopefully your policies will deal with. Does an employee continue to accrue PTO? Does an employee continue to accrue vacation? And I suspect that most people's policies say an employee who is regularly scheduled to work more than 24 hours a week or 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week, the benefits are always triggered by the regularly scheduled work time, and somebody on furlough wouldn't be meeting those eligibility requirements. So barring binding yourself by your own policies, I'm guessing a lot of the benefits that we'd be talking about other than health insurance, dental insurance are going to be not continue to accrue.
Okay. If an employee is exposed and diagnosed, is that covered under workers' comp? We talked about that. It depends on whether it was diagnosed due to work. All right. If there is a refusal to work or a refusal to fill out a self-assessment form, can an employer move to termination? Whether you can move to termination is going to depend on all kinds of factors, like whether you've got a collective or a bargaining agreement, whether the person has a contract. But as you heard from Julia, OSHA talks about the standards under which someone can refuse to work if they have a reasonable fear of imminent danger. And that may or may not be that hard to show. There are going to be some instances, particularly involved workers, where an employer may have to make that tough decision to say, if you're refusing to work, we're going to discipline you for that. But consult with counsel, because it will be a very fact-specific inquiry. I'll tell you an example. I got a call the other day from a client, and she said, well, Kathy, I get it if somebody, needs to be quarantined, or they've got someone at home who's sick, but what about the person who just says, I'm scared to come in? What should I do about that person? And I pointed out that for that particular person, it would be very easy for the person to just lie and say, oh my God, I've got flu-like symptoms. Or, oh my God, I've got somebody at home who's got flu-like symptoms. We don't want to give people a disincentive to speak how they're feeling. And Dr. Cedar spoke about the importance of keeping people's emotions at bay. And John spoke about the fact that this crisis will end. And maybe your best worker is the person who's not necessarily responding to this in the most logical or reasoned manner. Keep that in mind. Keep the big picture and the end game in mind. And remember, we always say in our seminars you've been to, do you ever terminate someone on the spot? Never terminate someone on the spot. You can always say, we're suspending you while we look into this situation, look into how you treat others. You don't have to move to terminate. You can take other actions to meet the needs of your business in the meantime. All right, we're going to take just a few more because we could be on all day, but when the federal legislation passes, we're hoping to provide additional resources, and folks on this phone call know that you can call us at Hirsch Roberts Weinstein at 617-348-4300. All right, I think that, let's see. Oh, keep scrolling. Okay, let's see. Okay, somebody just says, thank you, Bruce. And Bruce says, you're welcome. All right. Okay, we've talked about collecting unemployment while on a company's health care. Yes, the unemployment standards have been relaxed. You don't necessarily have to be actively looking for work. You don't have to have been permanently separated. Standards are relaxed. Encourage employees to apply. There may be some nuances on unemployment for the person who truly does not meet any of the criteria. But again, that might be a little tough to prove these days. All right. We have some essential staff who work and can't work from home. Any problem with paying them extra when they do come into work? Combat pay, as it's called. Absolutely, just be sure that you treat people consistently and also plan for the future. But you want to do what you need to do to keep the business operating. Any further on that? All right. Is the globe now considered high risk? Should we consider asking employees to quarantine if they traveled anywhere in the country? The latest news that I've seen is that any sort of travel can keep people exposed. And I believe I saw a question that said, well, how long do you quarantine? It's from the date that they could have been exposed. So if they just got off the plane, it would be 14 days of the last possible exposure.
So I've been getting this question a little bit too. Up to a week ago, it used to be that if you, and I still kind of like this approach, frankly, but it used to be that if you traveled through or to a country that was identified by the CDC as a particular threat level. They have threat levels 1, 2, and 3, and it's all the countries you'd expect. It's China, it's Italy, it's South Korea, Japan was maybe a threat level 1. That was the triggering point, and that gave us some comfort level as to why we were making these delineations. I think that the CDC is now, you look at their website, it's almost as if any international travel is now fair game to trigger this quarantine. I don't think any domestic, I don't think we're quite there yet where any domestic travel triggers a quarantine. I hope we haven't come to that point, and I don't think you'd find support for that on the CDC website, which is my binky, my safe zone. So, but I do think we've expanded to any international travel.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I'm guessing you will provide the slide deck from this webinar. And the answer is yes, we will. And yes, and a recording? No? Okay. Well, all right. Just bear in mind when you listen to the recording, things are changing. We're answering things on the fly. So, all right. How will the paid sick time and the paid time to care for family members for employees who work for employers over 500? That is one of the issues that is being debated in the Senate right now. There was an op-ed in the New York Times about this issue. Wait a minute, why are we excluding these big employers? And part of the answer people give is, oh, well, they already give sick time. Well, a lot of you on the phone are less than 500 and you already give sick time. So this is a debated issue, but not, the answer is not addressed yet. But remember, those employers over 500, they are subject to regular FMLA if they have more than 50, and there may be other laws that impact them. Okay, keep scrolling. Oh, we may be at the last question. If we have to terminate someone today due to their job being unable to be done from work from home, do we still have to pay them today with a live check? Yes, if you are formally separating someone's employment, you must pay all wages due on the date of termination and any accrued, unused paid time. I greatly appreciate the person who asked this question because it is so nice to end with a question that we actually have a clear, knowable answer to. We want to thank everybody for participating in this webinar. We are working at HRW, many of us remotely, some of us in sporadically, but we are answering questions for folks. So please keep the questions coming because we're learning from all of you as well. And I want to, again, leave with John and Bruce's comment that in these difficult times, sometimes the nuances of, would the EEOC consider this to be a protected disability are less important on how can we keep people safe, how can we keep people calm, and how can we get the right intel.